No one in that little diner understood why a man like Evan Brooks, owner of luxury hotels, and known for eating in places where plates cost more than a week's rent, would walk in and order the cheapest meal on the menu, and that strange choice created a quiet ripple through the room that made people look twice before pretending not to stare. But Lena didn't waver for a second as she greeted him with the same soft smile she offered to truck drivers, seniors, and teenagers grabbing fries after school, and something in that calm attitude caught his eye right away, especially because she didn't seem impressed, intimidated, or curious about who he was, which felt unusual for someone used to people adjusting their posture the moment he walked in. So he sat there trying to understand what drew him to her sincerity, all while wondering what pushed him into that diner on a day when everything in his life felt normal, yet strangely empty. And as he watched her move around with quiet grace and listened to the gentle way she spoke to everyone, a question started forming in his mind about who she really was and why her presence felt so grounding, planting doubts about what kind of moment he had just stepped into and nudging an early sense that something meaningful was about to shake the certainty he always had about his own world. Evan had barely taken 2 bites of his simple meal when he heard Lena's voice drifting from the counter as she talked softly to another waitress about her handmade candles, not bragging or promoting them, just mentioning that she had stayed up late the night before, pouring wax to keep up with orders, because the money helped her younger brother stay on track for his dream of going to college, and even though her co-worker urged her to put them on a small display by the register, Lena simply laughed it off and said she didn't like making guests feel pressured, explaining that eating in peace mattered more than selling anything, and this struck Evan so sharply that he looked up without meaning to, because in his world, every moment, greeting, smile, and gesture was meant to close a deal or raise a number. Yet here she was choosing comfort over profit, with a natural ease that felt almost unreal to him, and while she cleaned a nearby table with steady movements, he found himself wondering what kind of life led her to value kindness so deeply, what losses or hopes shaped that softness in her voice, and why she would prefer to struggle quietly rather than risk a single guest feeling uncomfortable. And that simple overheard conversation stirred an unexpected warmth in him, along with a growing curiosity about the sacrifices she hid behind that calm smile. When Lena returned to check on him, Evan tried to subtly ask about the candles as if he were making casual conversation, but she immediately shifted the focus back to whether he liked his meal and whether she could bring anything else, doing it with such natural gentleness that it was clear she wasn't avoiding the topic out of shyness, but out of a genuine desire not to make him feel cornered. And this small moment challenged everything Evan had been taught about success, because in his world people constantly pushed, tried, insisted, negotiated and calculated, yet this young woman standing by his table believed in something completely different, something he couldn't quite explain, but felt deeply, and the more she spoke, the more he sensed a quiet conviction behind her humility, as if she were guided by values formed through hardship and shaped by love rather than ambition. And he realized he wanted to understand her, not as a business opportunity or a motivational example, but as a person whose kindness carried a strength he didn't know he had been missing, pushing him into an internal conflict that grew stronger with every word she said, and leaving him wondering how one brief encounter could unravel ideas he had held for a lifetime. Even after she stepped away, her voice and manner stayed with him in a way he couldn't explain, and as he tasted the simple diner meal that cost less than a cup of coffee at most of his hotels, he realized it felt oddly meaningful, almost comforting in a way his high-priced dishes never did, and that sensation made something flutter inside him, like a warning that life was trying to tell him something he hadn't listened to before. And as he watched Lena move across the room, helping an elderly man sit down, offering an extra napkin to a toddler's mother, and smiling at a lonely regular who always sat by the window, he felt a strange discomfort rise in him, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had revealed a truth he didn't want to admit. Somewhere along the path of building empires and accumulating wealth, he had lost touch with the simple goodness that gave life meaning, and that realization followed him through every bite, stirring a restlessness that made his thoughts race in circles, pushing him to question why this random diner visit felt heavier than any boardroom negotiation. And as he stood to leave, he sensed that walking out wouldn't make the feeling disappear, raising the silent question of what he was meant to do with this unexpected emotional shift that refused to fade. On his way out, Evan paused by the counter and asked quietly if he could buy one of Lena's candles, speaking with a sincerity he didn't often use. But Lena shook her head gently and said she didn't want him to feel obliged, explaining once again that she preferred customers to enjoy their meal without any pressure, and that refusal hit him harder than any business deal he had ever negotiated, because it wasn't rejection, it was integrity, a kind of honesty that made him see her in a completely new light. And as he stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight, he felt a mix of awe and determination spreading through his chest like a spark catching fire, telling him that he couldn't just let this go, that he needed to understand her world and maybe even help without taking anything away from her dignity. And as he walked toward his car, the decision settled inside him with a certainty that surprised him, pulling him into a path he could no longer ignore, and he knew at that moment that whatever he discovered next about her candles, her life, and the dreams she protected with such quiet strength would reshape more than just his day, but possibly his entire understanding of wealth and purpose, urging the listener to wonder what he would uncover and how it would change everything that came after. Before we go on, take a second and pause the video to tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Moments like the one Evan is stepping into now always hit people differently, and it's amazing to see how folks from all over relate to these turning points. Go ahead and comment your city or state and then come right back so we can continue. Evan had barely left the diner when the thought of Lena's candles kept circling in his mind, so quiet yet so persistent that he found himself driving to a small weekend market where her co-worker mentioned she sometimes left a few pieces to be sold. He didn't want to make a scene or let anyone know who he was, because something about the way Lena handled herself made him feel that stepping too loudly into her world would break the very thing that moved him. After asking around with a tone far softer than he was used to, he finally found a tiny wooden stand with a handwritten sign and a few candles lined up in simple jars, each one smelling faintly of warm vanilla and something floral that reminded him of old memories he didn't visit often. He picked one up slowly, as if the story behind it could slip away if he wasn't careful, and studied the way the wax curved in gentle waves, as though shaped by tired but hopeful hands. Standing there between fruit stalls and local vendors chatting about their day, he realized that the little candle held more heart than some of the massive projects he had poured fortunes into. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Lena was wiping down a counter with a tired look in her eyes, as she quietly wondered whether her candle dream was nothing more than a hobby she couldn't afford to keep going. Thinking about her brother's growing college costs and the way each extra shift wore her down a little more, Evan didn't know any of this, but he felt somehow that her work carried something fragile, something that needed someone to believe in it before it faded away. As he walked back to his car holding the candle, he felt the scent follow him, filling the small space as he sat behind the wheel and turned the jar slowly in his hands. The craftsmanship wasn't perfect in the way factories defined perfection, but it was perfect in the way sincerity shows through small flaws, revealing hours of effort poured quietly after long workdays. He imagined Lena at her kitchen table, maybe late at night with only a small lamp on, trying different wicks and colors while thinking about the future she wanted for her brother, and the picture tightened something in his chest. For the first time in a long while, Evan felt vulnerable about how detached he had become from the human side of the world he profited from. At that same moment, Lena was stacking dishes in the back of the diner, whispering to herself that maybe she should take a break from candle making because it was costing more than it brought in. And that thought left her feeling strangely defeated, as though putting that dream aside meant letting go of a piece of herself she didn't want to lose. Evan didn't hear those words, but the weight of them seemed to echo in the quiet of his car as he lit the candle right there in the parking lot, letting the soft glow show him a truth he had ignored for years. The flame flickered gently, casting warm shadows that reminded him of summer nights long before success hardened his view of the world, and for a moment he just sat there breathing in the scent and letting it settle, a kind of peace he hadn't felt in ages. The more he stared at the little jar, the more he understood it wasn't just wax or fragrance, but an entire story built into something simple, and that story carried sacrifice, patience, and silent love. Lena wasn't making candles to get rich or to impress anyone. She made them to keep her brother's dream alive, to hold their family together in a way most people never saw. Evan closed his eyes, letting that reality wash over him, as he wondered whether he should tell her what the candle stirred inside him or keep his distance until he understood what he truly wanted to offer. He feared that revealing who he was might overwhelm her, or feel like he was inserting himself into her life too forcefully, and that fear kept him still, hesitating even as he felt drawn closer to her world. By the time the candle burned low, Evan had made up his mind about one thing. Lena's work mattered more than she believed, and he needed to understand how to help without taking away her pride or her control. But the question still pressed hard against him as he blew out the small flame and held the warm jar between his palms, carrying the weight of a decision that could change everything for both of them. The air around him felt charged with something new, something he wasn't ready to name yet, and the hook of uncertainty settled deep in him as he whispered to himself whether he'd step forward and reveal his identity or keep watching from afar until the right moment found him, leaving the listener wondering which path he'd dare to take next. Evan walked back into the diner the next afternoon with the same quiet step, trying not to draw attention, but something in him already felt different after spending the night thinking about that little candle and the meaning behind it. Lena was wiping down a booth, her shoulders slightly heavier than the day before, and even from across the room he could tell she hadn't slept much. When she saw him, she smiled, but it was a softer version of her usual smile, like she was carrying too many things at once. He sat down and she brought him water without asking, thanking him for coming back in a tone that made him feel both welcome and unexpectedly important. He wanted to tell her right away what the candle had made him feel, yet he held back, afraid that revealing too much too soon would complicate her day, rather than lighten it. Instead, he asked about her shift, and she laughed in that tired way people do when the day has been longer than their strength. He noticed a small burn mark on her wrist, probably from pouring wax late at night, and something inside him tightened with a mix of guilt and responsibility, because while he had the resources to change her struggle, she had no idea who he really was. Still, she talked about her brother with pride, saying he was working hard and she hoped she could keep up with costs, but the way her eyes lowered for a second showed she wasn't sure she could. When she set down his plate, Evan said quietly that her candles were beautiful, choosing his words with care so she wouldn't think he was making small talk. For a moment she froze, not expecting someone to say that so sincerely, then thanked him in a voice that carried both gratitude and disbelief, as if she didn't hear compliments often. She explained that sometimes she felt like maybe her dream was silly because it took time and money she barely had, and he told her that nothing done with love was ever silly, though he said it with a softness that surprised even him. She smiled again, but this time her smile cracked open enough for him to see the tired hope hiding behind it. The conversation drifted into little things. Customers they both found funny, the smell of cinnamon in the kitchen, how the diner's old coffee machine always rattled on cold mornings. But beneath the small talk lived a deeper current, pulling them toward understanding. At one point she admitted she had thought of giving up on the candles because work had been heavier than usual, and he felt an urge to tell her she didn't have to carry everything alone. Yet he stayed quiet, because he didn't want to cross a line she didn't know he saw. When she stepped away to help an older couple settle into their booth, Evan watched the way she leaned down to make their day easier, how she spoke gently to people who were often ignored or rushed in other places, and he felt that same heavy question return. Why did someone with so little offer so much to others without asking anything back? When she returned to refill his drink, he asked whether she ever took a break for herself, and she chuckled, saying that people who prioritize others don't get many breaks, but learn to live with that rhythm. The truth in her voice hit him harder than he expected. He replied softly that even people who give a lot need space to breathe, and she paused as if no one had said that to her in a long time. Something warm crossed her expression, like a small piece of her guard lowered, and for a brief second they shared a silence that said more than words. Moments like that silence are familiar to so many people listening, times when a single sentence or glance makes someone feel seen after carrying things alone for too long. It's the kind of moment that brings people together in the comments, sharing how they felt this same shift in their own lives and how hearing someone else open up helps them feel less alone in the world. When Lena finally broke the silence, she thanked him again, not just for the compliment about her candles, but for noticing she was tired, saying most people didn't pay attention to things like that. Her gratitude wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Evan felt a small change inside himself, something like humility growing roots. He wanted to say who he really was, to explain why her kindness mattered so much, but the words stayed trapped, because he feared the moment would collapse under the truth. Instead, he told her he admired how she balanced everything with grace, and she laughed softly, telling him she didn't feel graceful most days. They shared another brief smile before she was called to the back, leaving Evan alone with the growing realization that he couldn't keep coming to the diner without deciding what he truly intended. A thought lingered in his mind as he watched her disappear behind the swinging kitchen door, a question that pulled tightly at the story ahead, pushing the listener to wonder how long he could hide who he really was and what he would do once his two worlds collided in a way neither of them could ignore. Evan returned to the diner the next morning earlier than usual, hoping the quiet hour would give him a chance to talk to Lena without the rush of customers pulling her away. She looked surprised to see him, but not uneasy, more like someone who didn't expect kindness to show up twice in the same week. She brought him coffee, and instead of standing in her usual ready-to-move posture, she sat for a moment at the edge of the booth, as if her body finally admitted it needed a pause. He noticed the shadows under her eyes and the soft tremble in her hands as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. When he asked how she was holding up, she let out a slow breath, the kind that carries more truth than a full confession, and she told him her brother had stayed up late talking about the colleges he dreamed of, not knowing she had been calculating whether she could afford the next set of books he needed. She said she didn't want him to ever feel guilty or responsible for her struggle, that she wanted him to feel free to dream big, because she believed life gave people like him only a few windows of real opportunity, and she didn't want to be the reason one of those windows closed. Her voice cracked just enough for Evan to feel it, like a hand on his chest, tightening around a memory he thought he had buried deep. He leaned forward, drawn by a sincerity that made the diner feel smaller and quieter, and listened as she talked about how making candles became her way of sending love into the world without asking anything back. She said that lighting a candle made people feel calm, safe and connected, and that the idea of being part of someone's peaceful moment meant more to her than any sale. Evan felt something shift inside him, a soft but undeniable twisting of old memories rising to the surface. He remembered when he had once worked long nights trying to keep his first tiny hotel from failing, selling furniture he loved just to pay the bills, telling himself it was worth it because offering shelter to strangers felt meaningful, before the business world taught him to measure value in numbers instead of stories. Listening to Lena made him realize how far he had drifted from that version of himself, and for a moment he felt almost ashamed of how easily he had let the world convince him that gentle dreams were weaknesses instead of strengths. She didn't know any of this, but her words pushed him into a kind of stillness he hadn't felt in years, and he found himself wanting to protect her dream the way he wished someone had protected his. When she apologized for talking too much, he shook his head and said her words mattered more than she realized. A soft blush crept across her cheeks, and she admitted that sometimes she questioned whether pouring so much time into candles made any sense when she barely kept up with bills. Evan looked at her jar of crayons she used to color order slips and noticed the way she had little drawings along the edge of her notebook, small things she did to brighten her long shifts. He told her these little details showed who she really was, someone who put care into everything even when no one noticed, and she held his gaze for a moment longer than she usually did, something unspoken passing between them. He wondered whether to tell her that he had already bought one of her candles, that he had sat in his car letting its warm scent take him back to a time when he still believed in small acts of love. But the words felt too heavy to place on her shoulders just yet. And in that quiet pause between what he wanted to say and what he chose to keep hidden, something shifted again, a hint that whatever decision he made now would carry weight later, shaping what would unfold and returning to him in ways he couldn't yet imagine, creating the feeling that this moment was planting seeds for a future he wasn't ready to name. When Lena stood to return to work, she thanked him for listening in a way that felt deeper than politeness, as if having someone care even for a moment lifted some invisible weight she carried alone. Evan watched her walk away and felt that same question return, the one that had been growing since the candle burned in his car. Was he meant to simply watch her from a distance, or was he supposed to step into her world in a way that could change both their paths? He knew he couldn't keep pretending his presence there was casual. Something meaningful was taking shape between them, a quiet truth forming on the edge of both their lives. As he took another sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest wasn't from the drink, but from the realization that he was no longer the same man who had walked into the diner that first day. And the listener is left wondering whether this awakening would push him into action or drive him back behind the walls he had built for so long. The rain had started just after sunset, tapping softly against the diner windows like a reminder that some days end heavier than they begin, and Lena stood behind the counter, staring at the small notebook where she kept track of her candle expenses, her eyes moving slowly over the rising prices of wax and jars. She tried to blink away the worry building in her chest, but the numbers told a truth she didn't want to face. Evan walked in quietly, noticing right away that the glow she usually carried was dimmed, almost hidden behind the way she pressed her lips together and held the pen like it weighed more than it should. He took a seat without saying much, giving her space, but when she finally approached his table, he could see the strain in the way her shoulders drooped and the way her smile didn't reach her eyes. She asked if he wanted the usual, and he nodded, though his attention stayed locked on her face, trying to read the story she wasn't telling. When she turned to walk away, he saw her pause just for a second, as if gathering strength before taking another step, and that small, silent moment hit him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. She brought his food over a few minutes later, and he thanked her in a tone softer than he planned, making her look up at him with a surprised expression. He asked if everything was okay, not pushing, only offering a quiet space for honesty. Lena hesitated, tapping her fingers lightly against the edge of the table, her eyes drifting toward the rain outside as though the answer was hiding somewhere in the streetlights. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tired sadness. She said she didn't know how much longer she could keep making candles because expenses had gone up again, and even though people liked them, she couldn't make enough to cover everything. She worried her brother would feel guilty if he knew how hard she was pushing herself, so she kept the weight of it inside. As she talked, her hands trembled slightly, and Evan felt a knot tighten in his chest, the kind of knot that comes from wanting to fix something, but knowing that the wrong kind of help could break a person's pride. He listened closely, seeing the pain behind her words, and feeling his own memories rising like ghosts. Long nights, working impossible hours, telling himself struggle was just the beginning of success, then later forgetting that kindness had ever been part of the equation. He noticed the way she kept running her thumb over a faint burn mark on her wrist, a mark he hadn't seen earlier, probably from pouring wax when she was too tired to be careful. That simple gesture made something inside him twist painfully. He had lived so long in a world where money solved everything that he had forgotten what it meant to carry a dream with nothing but hope and effort. Watching her now, he realized how empty his world had become, how silent his large office felt compared to the soft glow of the little candle she had made with her tired hands. When she apologized for venting, he shook his head gently and told her she didn't have to pretend to be strong all the time. His voice cracked slightly, surprising him, because he wasn't used to talking with that kind of vulnerability. She stared at him, stunned for a moment, as if she hadn't expected someone to notice the quiet battle she'd been fighting alone. She stepped back, holding her order pad to her chest, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The diner around them hummed with soft conversations, clinking plates, and the low buzz of the neon sign outside. But between them, the air felt still, thick with a truth both of them sensed, but didn't yet name. Evan remembered the candle he had bought, and how its warm scent had filled his car, reminding him of a time when his dreams had been built on heart instead of numbers. Lena remembered how she used to love the sound of candle wax cracking as it cooled, a sound that once brought comfort but now carried stress she didn't want to admit. Their eyes met briefly, and for a second it felt like each of them could see the other's exhaustion and fear, as if the walls between their worlds were becoming thinner by the day. Evan almost told her right then who he was and how much he could change her life, but the words stuck because he didn't want to make her feel small or make her think he pitied her. She didn't need saving. She needed someone to believe in her without taking control away. The conflict pulled at him so strongly that he had to look away for a moment to gather himself. Lena, seeing his silence, assumed she had shared too much and whispered a quiet apology that broke his heart a little. He assured her she didn't owe him another word, and the gratitude in her eyes made him swallow hard. When she walked back to the counter, he watched her reflection in the window, her shoulders tense as she braced herself against more bad news she hadn't even heard yet. By the time he finished his meal, the rain had grown heavier, blurring the street outside. He sat for a long moment before standing, feeling the weight of a decision forming inside him, one that would carry consequences for both of them. Lena glanced his way, a silent question in her eyes, but he only offered a gentle nod before moving toward the door. Something important had solidified between them, something fragile but undeniable, and though neither of them spoke it aloud, both could feel that the moment they reached their breaking points was closer than either wanted to admit, leaving the sense that one final step waited ahead, one that would decide everything that came next. The night felt heavier than usual as Lena sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by jars that once held hope, but now felt like reminders of a dream slipping out of her hands. The soft light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room, touching the boxes she had half filled with unused wicks, leftover wax, and labels she had handwritten with care. She ran her fingers over one of the labels, the edges slightly curled from the warmth of her hands during late nights spent trying to keep the business alive. Tonight she whispered to herself that it was time to stop, time to accept that her candlework was more weight than help. The words sounded like betrayal in her own ears, but she pushed the thought down as she taped a box shut, feeling her chest tighten as if sealing away a piece of her heart. She didn't want her brother to know. He was counting on her, believing she was strong enough to do everything, and the idea of disappointing him made her eyes burn. She wiped her tears quickly, as if no one should see even when she was alone. Across town, Evan sat in his silent penthouse, staring at the city lights spreading across the night sky like a blanket of distant stars. His mind played back every moment with Lena, every tired smile she hid behind kindness, every small tremble in her voice when she spoke about her brother, every gesture that showed how deeply she cared without expecting anything in return. He thought about the candle he had bought, still sitting on his coffee table, its wick darkened from the test flame he had lit on the day he bought it. He leaned forward and picked it up again, turning it slowly in his hands, feeling the uneven bits of wax that proved it was made by human hands, not machines. That imperfection made it more beautiful than anything he had ever purchased. It reminded him of the early years of his own journey, when effort mattered more than image, and he realized with a clarity that shook him that somewhere along the climb he had mistaken wealth for meaning and success for purpose. Looking at the candle now, he felt something break open inside him, not pain but truth, a truth he had ignored for far too long. He stood up abruptly, driven by a feeling he couldn't push down anymore. He knew he had to step forward, not as a billionaire trying to rescue someone or fix a problem with money, but as a man who understood what it meant to fight for a dream with everything you had. He thought of Lena packing away her supplies, certain she had failed, and the ache in his chest deepened. The thought of her giving up felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain, as if a light the world needed was about to be blown out. He realized he didn't want to stay silent anymore, didn't want to let another day pass without showing her that her work mattered. But a new fear rose in him too. How could he reveal who he truly was without making her feel small, or making her believe he saw her life as something to fix? He paced the room, his steps echoing in the large space that suddenly felt too empty, almost cold. He had never struggled with decisions when money was the solution, but this time, money wasn't the answer. Heart was. Meanwhile, Lena placed the last box on the floor beside her and sank into the chair with a sigh that came from deep inside. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wrap around her like a blanket worn thin. For a moment she imagined what it would feel like to tell her brother she couldn't keep the candlework going, and the imagined look on his face made her chest ache. She whispered a promise to herself that she would still find a way to support him, even if it meant giving up something she loved. She didn't notice the candles still sitting on the shelf beside her, the ones she had made with the last bit of wax she had, each one carrying a piece of hope she wasn't ready to see. At the same moment, Evan stared out the window and made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit back and let her dream fade. He didn't know exactly how he would approach her, or how he would explain his intentions, but he knew he had to act. He grabbed his coat, heart beating faster than it had in years, feeling for the first time that he wasn't chasing profit or progress. He was chasing something real. Moments like this always make people think about what choices they would make in the same situation, whether they would step forward or stay quiet, and I'd love to hear what you think. Would you take that risk if you were in Evan's place, or would you hold back like he almost did? Drop your thoughts, and if these stories move you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. These journeys grow stronger when you're here with us. As the night deepened, Evan stepped out into the cool air and headed toward a decision that would change both their lives, carrying with him not wealth, but a simple truth he'd finally remembered. Sometimes the smallest light can change the darkest moment. Evan drove through the early morning light with a heaviness in his chest, gripping the steering wheel tighter every time he imagined Lena sitting alone at her kitchen table, packing away the pieces of her candle dream. He had made his decision in the quiet of his penthouse, but deciding something in silence was one thing, and standing in front of her with the truth was another. His heart beat harder than he liked to admit as he walked into a small office inside one of his hotels and asked his manager to place a large wholesale order for candles under a separate name, making sure the request looked like it came from a boutique supplier rather than from him personally. He wanted the order to be real, something she could grow into, not a charity gesture that would make her feel small. Still, the amount he asked for would change her life overnight, and that thought made his chest tighten with both excitement and fear. When he finally left the hotel, he carried the weight of a choice that would reveal everything he had been hiding. He knew there was no turning back. Hours later, Lena finished her shift at the diner with a quiet sadness hanging over her. She kept thinking of the boxes sealed the night before, sitting on her kitchen floor like silent reminders of something she was letting go of. As she wiped down the last table, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer, but something nudged her to pick up. A gentle voice on the other end introduced themselves as someone representing a hotel chain that wanted to place a large order of her candles. Lena froze, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. She asked if they had the right person, her voice shaking, and the caller laughed in a kind way, telling her they had heard wonderful things about her work. When the call ended, she stood there, stunned, the weight she felt that morning suddenly shifting in her chest, replaced by something she hadn't felt in days: hope. But with hope came fear too. She had no idea how she would fulfill such a big order, and part of her wondered if she should refuse it to avoid disappointing anyone. As she stepped outside, her head swirling with doubt and disbelief, she saw Evan standing by his car in the parking lot. He wasn't dressed in a suit today, just jeans and a simple jacket, but there was a nervous tension in the way he held himself. When he saw her, he lifted his hand in a small wave, not the confident gesture of a billionaire, but the hesitant wave of someone afraid of being misunderstood. She walked toward him slowly, unsure what he needed from her, and when she reached him, he took a breath as if pulling courage from somewhere deep. He said he wanted to talk to her privately for a moment if she didn't mind, and something in his voice made her nod, even though she wasn't sure why her heart suddenly felt unsteady. They stepped behind the diner near the old picnic table, where employees sometimes took breaks on warm days. The air smelled faintly of rain, and Lena hugged her arms around herself as she waited for him to speak. Evan looked at the ground for a moment before raising his eyes to meet hers. He told her he had been thinking a lot about their conversations, about her brother, about her candles, and about the kindness she carried so naturally it almost felt invisible until someone needed it. She listened quietly, unsure where he was going, but her breath caught when he finally said he hadn't been fully honest with her. He explained that his name was Evan Brooks, the owner of the hotel chain that had just contacted her, and the shock on her face made him pause. He kept talking quickly but gently, explaining that he hadn't told her earlier because he never wanted her to think he came to the diner as someone above her or that he cared about her candles out of pity. He said he admired her work, her values, and the heart she poured into everything she did. He explained that the order wasn't charity, that he genuinely wanted her candles in his hotels because they carried something money couldn't buy. She took a step back and stared at him, trying to understand how the kind man who sat at her table every day was also the billionaire whose name appeared on billboards and magazines. Her voice trembled when she asked why he would go through all this trouble. His answer was simple. He told her that she had reminded him of who he used to be before the world convinced him to stop believing in small, meaningful things. He said she had brought back something he thought he'd lost, and he wanted to give her work the chance it deserved. But even as he spoke, he knew this was the moment when everything could collapse. She could walk away, accuse him of lying, or think he had manipulated her trust. The fear in his chest grew with every second she stayed silent. It's in moments like this, when the truth finally comes out and nothing can be taken back, that choices weigh the most. What would you do in her place? Would you trust someone who hid their identity to understand you, or would the shock push you away? Leave a comment with your honest thoughts. These moments keep the story alive in ways that matter. Lena finally sat down at the old picnic table, burying her face in her hands for a moment before looking up at him. Her voice was quiet when she said she didn't know whether to be angry, grateful, or scared. and hearing that nearly broke him. He said he understood if she never wanted to speak to him again, but he hoped she would believe that his intentions came from a place of respect, not power. She looked at him long and hard, searching for any sign of arrogance, but all she saw was a man standing in front of her without the shield of wealth or status, asking for a chance to show he meant every word. She took a shaky breath and said she needed time to process everything, but she didn't walk away. That small choice felt like the air shifting, like the first crack of sunlight after a long storm. Evan nodded, telling her he would give her all the time she needed, yet the tension between them left the sense that something much bigger was stirring beneath the surface, something that would soon change both of their lives in ways neither had fully imagined. The next day, the air around the diner felt different, almost as if the world itself had paused, waiting to see what would happen between them. Lena stepped outside after her shift, still holding the weight of the previous day in her chest, unsure what to make of Evan's confession. She saw him standing near the edge of the parking lot, not leaning against his car this time, but pacing slowly, like someone who wasn't sure he had the right to stay. When she approached, he straightened up, looking both nervous and hopeful, the combination making her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. She told him she had been thinking a lot, and he nodded as though he understood everything she wasn't saying. They walked together to a small bench under a tree, a quiet spot away from the noise of the street, where the morning sun filtered through the branches and painted soft light across their faces. Evan took a deep breath and said he wanted to talk honestly, without hiding anything, because hiding had already complicated everything more than he meant to. She listened closely as he told her that the order she received was real, not a trick or a test, and that his hotels genuinely wanted her candles. He explained why he didn't attach his name to it, saying he knew how power could feel like pressure, and he didn't want her to think she was being offered something because of who he was rather than what she created. Lena looked down at her hands, feeling a mix of gratitude and fear, the two emotions pulling at her in opposite directions. She admitted she didn't know if she was ready for something that big, that sometimes she felt like she barely kept her life together as it was. Evan listened gently, never interrupting, and when she finished, he told her he understood that fear more than she realized. He explained that when he started his first hotel, he was terrified every day that he would lose everything, and that fear stayed with him until he forgot what courage had felt like. Seeing her work, her effort, her kindness, brought back something he thought he had lost, something that made him want to help her grow, not because she needed saving, but because she deserved support. Her eyes filled with tears, she tried to blink away. She asked him quietly why he cared so much, why someone like him would get involved in something as small as her candles. His answer was soft but steady. He said her work wasn't small. It carried heart, patience, and purpose, things that money couldn't manufacture. He told her candles reminded him of the early days of his own journey, before success made him forget the value of simple, meaningful things. He looked at her with a sincerity that made the world around them seem to fade. Then he said the words that made her breath catch. He wanted to propose a partnership, a real one, where her candles would become a standard in his hotels, but with full respect for her vision. She would keep the creative control, the design, the meaning behind every jar. He would help with logistics, production, and distribution, so she wouldn't drown in costs or long nights alone. She took a step back, overwhelmed by the idea of stepping into a world so much bigger than what she had built at her kitchen table. Her voice trembled when she said she wasn't sure she knew how to run something like that she might ruin everything, because she had never led anything beyond her small batches of candles. Evan shook his head, stepping closer but not crowding her, and told her she didn't have to know everything right now. He said learning would be part of the journey, and he would make sure she had the tools, the people, and the time to grow into her own success. He reminded her that no one ever feels ready for good things. They only learn to hold on to what matters, and trust that they can learn the rest along the way. She looked up at him, eyes glistening, and whispered that she didn't want to be someone's project or pity case. He reached out with careful hands, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his gesture, and told her he didn't see her as someone to fix. He saw her as someone to walk beside, someone whose talent and heart deserved room to breathe. She stared at him, searching for any sign of ego or hidden agenda, but all she found was honesty and quiet determination. The silence between them softened, warming like a slow sunrise. Moments like this always touch people deeply, that mix of fear and possibility when life opens a door that once felt locked. Many who hear this kind of story remember their own turning points, times when someone believed in them, right when they doubted themselves most, and it creates a feeling of shared understanding that connects strangers who might never meet. Lena took a long breath, feeling the weight of her doubts settling and shifting inside her. She told him she wasn't saying yes yet, but she wasn't saying no either. She needed to see that his offer came from a place of respect and not obligation, and he nodded, as though he had been waiting for that exact response. He said she deserved to make this decision without rush, and that he would support her, whether she chose to expand her business or keep it the way it was. For the first time since he revealed who he was, she felt a small warmth spread through her chest, the warmth of someone realizing they were being seen, not for their struggle, but for their strength. As they stood there under the tree, the sound of cars passing softened behind them, and the wind carried the faint smell of morning coffee from the diner. Lena tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked at Evan with a new kind of openness, the beginning of trust forming in the quiet space between their breaths. He smiled gently, a smile that didn't try to convince her but simply held space for her choice. The moment felt like standing on the edge of a new road, one she never imagined she would walk. By the time they parted, nothing had been fully decided, yet everything felt changed. The question lingered softly in her heart and in the listener's mind. Would she dare to step into a future that once felt impossible? And could she trust that the man offering her this chance saw her as an equal, not someone to protect, but someone to believe in? The next morning, Lena stood at the entrance of one of Evan's hotels with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to hide how nervous she felt. She'd only seen buildings like this from the outside, walking past them on days when she dreamed about a life she thought she'd never touch. Evan waited for her by the revolving doors, not with the posture of a man showing off his empire, but with the quiet humility of someone inviting her into a space he hoped she would one day feel at home in. When she stepped beside him, he smiled gently and told her that today wasn't about business, numbers, or decisions. It was simply about seeing what her work could become if she allowed herself to imagine bigger. She nodded, though her breath trembled a little, and followed him inside. The lobby opened around her like another world, filled with warm lights and soft music echoing through the space. People walked by carrying luggage, and the scent of fresh flowers drifted in the air, but what caught her attention most was the way all these details came together to create a feeling that wasn't far from what she tried to put inside her candles. Evan watched her expression carefully, seeing the wonder in her eyes, and something inside him softened even more. He asked if she could picture her candles placed on the tables near the sitting area, maybe at the front desk, or in the spa section upstairs. She said she could, though her voice shook, and he told her she didn't need to worry about perfection, because the heart she put into her work already carried more value than most things money could buy. She looked up at him, surprised again by how gently he spoke, and he motioned for her to follow him toward the elevators. As they stepped out on a higher floor, he led her into one of the rooms that was being prepared for a new guest. The bed was neatly made. The curtains were drawn open to reveal a stunning city view, and soft, natural light filled the space. He placed one of her candles on the nightstand, one he had brought with him, and lit it. The soft flame flickered gently, releasing a warm scent that slowly filled the room. Lena covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the sight of her candle glowing in a space she had never imagined it could belong. Evan watched her quietly, giving her time to take in the moment. She walked closer, staring at the small flame, as if seeing a part of herself she had forgotten. She whispered that she never thought something she made could change the feeling of a place like this. Evan replied that it already had, because it carried her story inside it, and stories had a way of transforming everything they touched. They moved through different parts of the hotel, and everywhere they went he showed her spaces where her candles could bring warmth or comfort. She imagined travelers lighting them during a stressful work trip, families using them during quiet evenings, or couples placing them on hotel balconies while talking about their dreams. The more she saw, the more she realized her work didn't have to be small. She had made those candles believing they were only meant for her community, but now she saw how they could reach people far beyond her neighborhood. Evan didn't rush her or push her to decide. Instead, he asked her what she felt when she walked through these halls, and she told him softly that she felt seen, maybe for the first time in a long while. And right in that shift, that moment where a quiet dream begins to feel possible, something deeper starts to move beneath the surface. Choices made here won't just shape their next steps. They'll return later with a force neither of them fully understands yet, pulling the story toward a moment that has been waiting in the background since the day they met. After the tour, they found themselves in a quiet outdoor courtyard behind the hotel, where small lights hung from the trees, glowing like tiny stars. The space felt peaceful, almost intimate, and for a moment they simply stood there in silence. Evan looked at her carefully and asked what scared her most about saying yes to his offer. She took a deep breath and said she feared losing herself in something too big, feared people thinking she didn't belong in a world like his, feared failing and proving her doubts right. He listened without judgment, then told her that fear didn't mean she wasn't capable. It meant she cared deeply about what she created. He admitted that he had lost sight of that for a long time, letting success drown out the voice inside him that once believed in small beginnings. Walking beside her these last days reminded him of why he started, reminded him that success without heart wasn't worth anything at all. She watched him speak with a sincerity she didn't expect from someone with so much power. He told her that if she agreed, this wouldn't be a partnership built on control, but on trust. He would handle the parts that overwhelmed her, and she would lead the creative side that gave the candles their soul. The idea scared her, but at the same time it lit something inside her, the faint glow of a courage she thought she had lost when she packed away her supplies. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of that feeling settle. When she opened them again, the world around them felt different, smaller in some ways, larger in others. Evan stepped closer, careful not to cross any line, and told her that whatever she chose, he would respect it. His voice carried no pressure, only hope. She whispered that everything felt so big now, almost unreal, and he smiled gently, telling her that maybe big things were supposed to feel that way at the beginning. Her heart trembled at the thought, but for the first time, the idea of stepping into something bigger didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a chance. They walked back toward the entrance together, and Lena paused right before the doors, looking back at the hotel with new eyes, the spaces where her candles might shine, the people who might feel comforted by them, the dream she might rebuild. Not alone this time. Evan watched her, sensing she was on the edge of a choice that would shape the rest of her life. The air between them felt charged with more than possibility. It felt like the calm before a beautiful turning point. By the time they stepped outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in gold and soft pink. Lena stood beside him, holding the moment close, knowing that soon she would have to give him an answer. And the listener is left with one clear question echoing softly at the edge of the scene. Now that everything is in place, will she find the strength to fully embrace the partnership that could change everything? The sky was still painted in soft evening colors when Lena walked home after the hotel tour, her mind spinning with everything she had seen. She held her bag close to her chest, as if it carried something fragile, something she wasn't ready to break by thinking too loudly. When she reached her apartment, she didn't turn on the lights right away. She stood by the window, watching cars pass below, feeling both the weight and the warmth of a decision she knew she had to make soon. Her candles, once boxed away in quiet defeat, now sat scattered on the counter where she had placed them earlier that morning, unsure whether she dared to hope again. She ran her fingers along one jar, touching the uneven wax, the label she had written by hand, and she whispered to herself that she didn't want to lose who she was, not to fear, not to success, not to anyone. The room felt too quiet for such a big decision, and she closed her eyes, feeling her heart thudding softly against her ribs, reminding her that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it breathes. Meanwhile, Evan stood outside the hotel where he had shown her the rooms, staring up at the windows as the city lights flickered against the glass. He felt nervous in a way he wasn't used to, a way that stripped him of the safety he usually carried in his confidence. Showing her that world had opened something inside him, something tender and unguarded. He knew he was asking a lot of her, not just in work, but in trust, and that truth kept him restless. He paced near the entrance, replaying every look she had given him, every tremble in her voice, every moment she seemed torn between fear and possibility. He wasn't afraid she would say no for business reasons. He was afraid she would say no because he hadn't yet proven that he could meet her as an equal, not as a man with power trying to pull her into a world she didn't choose. He inhaled deeply, feeling the cold air fill his chest, grounding him in the truth that this moment mattered more than anything he had done in years. The next morning, Lena asked him to meet her at a small park near the diner, a quiet place with a few benches and a fountain that made a soft, calming sound as water trickled down its stone sides. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench with her hands folded tightly in her lap. He approached slowly, sensing the seriousness in her posture. She didn't smile right away, and he didn't force small talk. He sat beside her, giving her space, waiting for her to speak. After a long silence, she said she needed to tell him something honest, something she had been afraid to admit. Her voice was steady but soft as she confessed that her biggest fear wasn't failing the partnership. It was losing herself inside it, losing the simple heart she had always tried to protect. She said she didn't want to become someone running after money or recognition. She didn't want her candles to stop feeling like small pieces of love, and she didn't want him to see her differently if she struggled or stumbled along the way. Saying all of this made her throat tighten, but she forced herself to keep going because she knew the truth had to be spoken before any real decision could be made. Evan listened without moving, his chest tightening with emotion he didn't even try to hide. When she finished, he let out a slow breath, and she felt the warmth of his sincerity before he said a word. He looked at her gently, the kind of look that held both respect and pain, and he told her he had fears too. He feared being vulnerable in front of someone he admired. He feared that she might think he chose her candles out of pity instead of admiration. And he feared that if he stepped too close, he would bring the weight of his world into hers, a world he knew could be harsh and demanding. He said he didn't want to take anything from her, not her peace, not her independence, not her voice. He wanted to build something with her, not over her. She turned her head slightly, watching him as his words sank in, and something inside her loosened, like a knot finally untangling. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the candle he had bought from the market, the one she didn't know he had kept. He placed it between them on the bench, letting the morning light fall across its glass surface. He told her this candle had changed him long before she knew it, that its scent and flame had reminded him of the man he used to be, the man he wanted to find again. She touched the jar with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the thought that something she made in exhaustion and hope had reached someone in ways she never imagined. The moment felt impossibly still, as if the world had paused just to let this truth settle between them. She looked at him with tears forming in her eyes, and before she could stop herself, she whispered that she would say yes to the partnership, but only if he promised one thing. She said she needed her work to stay rooted in love, not business targets or fast expansion. She needed the freedom to grow at a pace that still felt real, still felt like her, and she needed him to see her as a partner, not a project or investment. Evan didn't hesitate. He nodded immediately, saying he wouldn't want it any other way. He promised her that her voice would lead the creative side, that her values would guide the brand, and that the partnership would honor who she was. He said her strength came from her heart, and he would never ask her to give that up. As he spoke, she felt something inside her open, like a soft bloom after a long winter. Her fear didn't disappear completely, but it no longer controlled her. She exhaled shakily, letting the acceptance settle in her chest, and he watched her with quiet gratitude, knowing this moment meant more to her than she could ever say. She finally nodded, a gentle but firm nod that held the weight of her courage. He smiled, not with excitement but with relief and deep respect, and in that simple exchange everything turned. The past struggles, the doubts, the exhaustion, the fear, they all shifted into something new, something shared, something hopeful. They sat together for a long moment, listening to the fountain, feeling the world settle into a calm they hadn't known in weeks. The air around them seemed softer, like the first warm breeze of spring after a cold season. Lena looked at him and asked quietly what their new life might look like from here, and he told her he didn't know the details yet, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it became, it would be built on truth and respect, two things they had both fought hard to rediscover. She closed her eyes briefly, letting those words sink in, and when she opened them again, the path forward felt clearer, brighter, ready to be walked. And with that, the story moved one breath away from its final resolution, carried by the soft glow of a promise that had just been made between two hearts, learning to trust again. Months passed gently, folding one day into the next, until the world Lena once knew began to look different in the softest, most unexpected ways. Her apartment no longer smelled only of cooled wax and long nights. It carried the quiet hum of hope that had returned the moment she said yes to herself. Boxes of materials were no longer signs of an ending. They were signs of a beginning, stacked carefully along the walls as she shaped her new life with steady, thoughtful hands. She had moved her candle work from the cramped kitchen to a small rented workspace Evan helped her find, a place with windows that invited sunlight in and shelves that displayed her candles like small stars waiting to shine. She didn't rush the growth. She let it unfold at a pace that made her feel grounded, never letting the size of the opportunity swallow the heart of her craft. Evan visited the workspace often, never intruding, always offering support in small ways that felt natural. He brought coffee sometimes, listened to her talk through ideas, or simply sat nearby while she tested new scents. Their conversations changed over the months, growing deeper as their trust grew. He never treated her like someone he had rescued. He treated her like someone whose strength helped rebuild something inside him. His hotels began to carry her candles in their lobbies, hallways, and rooms. Guests left messages saying the warm scent reminded them of home or made their travels softer. Some asked how to buy the candles, and Lena smiled every time she read those notes, remembering the night she almost packed her dream away forever. At the diner, things changed too. Her co-workers asked about her business, cheering every new step. Her brother Jake, who had once doubted if college was even possible, now walked his campus with a glow that made her heart swell every time she thought about it. The first day she dropped him off at the dorm, he hugged her tight, whispering that he would make her proud. She didn't tell him that she already was, that she always had been. Seeing him start a new chapter without carrying the weight of her struggle made every long night worth it. Her candles had not only carried light into strangers' lives, they had carried him into his future. Evan changed too. He spent less time behind closed boardroom doors and more time walking through his hotels, paying attention to details he had once overlooked. He watched how people relaxed near the warm glow of Lena's candles, how the atmosphere softened, how the staff smiled more. He felt something inside him settle, a sense of purpose that didn't come from expanding his empire, but from helping someone else's work grow. The world he built finally reflected something meaningful, something human. He carried himself differently now, not with the armor of power, but with the quiet strength of someone who had rediscovered why he began in the first place. One evening, they met in the lobby of his flagship hotel. The guests were checking in, the staff moved with calm rhythm, and a soft golden candle burned near the entrance, filling the space with gentle warmth. Lena watched it flicker for a moment, remembering the first candle she ever made in her tiny apartment, back when she had no idea where life would take her. Evan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, looking at the flame as though it carried the story of both their hearts. He told her softly that this lobby had never felt as alive as it did now. She didn't answer right away. She simply breathed in the scent she created and felt the circle of her journey close in a way that made her eyes sting with emotion. She turned to look at him, and he met her eyes with the same honesty he had shown her at the park months earlier. They didn't need big speeches. The changes in their lives spoke for them. She said quietly that none of this would have happened if not for the moment he ordered that cheapest meal at the diner. He shook his head, saying it happened because she never stopped giving her heart to the world, even when the world gave nothing back. His voice was warm, sincere, and it settled deep inside her. She smiled at him, a smile that held gratitude, trust, and the quiet understanding that their paths had woven together, not through power, but through kindness. The candle on the lobby table flickered again, casting a soft glow on the polished floor. People walked past it without knowing the story behind it, without knowing how that small flame had pulled two very different lives into one shared purpose. Lena felt the past finally let go of her shoulders, replaced by a steady warmth that promised a future built on light rather than fear. She reached out and touched the candle's glass, feeling the heat against her fingertips, and whispered that she was ready for whatever came next. Evan didn't look away from her when she said it. He simply nodded, as though he had been waiting for those words for a long time. Outside the hotel the night deepened, but inside the soft flame continued to glow, steady and bright, a reminder of where everything began and how far it had carried them. That candle would burn out, of course, like all candles do, but the change it inspired would not. It had lit a path for both of them, one shaped by courage, kindness, and a partnership built on true respect. And as the flame danced one last time before the wax softened, the story settled gently into its final moment, leaving the listener with a quiet truth. Sometimes the smallest lights guide us to the biggest changes, and sometimes a single act of kindness can rewrite the course of a life. Before we close this chapter, let me ask you something straight from the heart of this ending. If you were in Lena's place, would you have dared to trust a future that once felt too big to imagine? And if you were Evan, would you have found the courage to step forward with honesty instead of power? Pause for a moment and share your thoughts, because stories like this grow stronger when different voices come together around them. Now, if you felt this journey the same way others have, take a second to comment your first and last name to show you made it all the way here, and drop a like to help these stories keep reaching more people. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one, because every new chapter is built with the same heart and care. And if this story touched you because of the way kindness changed everything, the next video will move you even deeper, with a twist that turns an ordinary moment into a life lesson you won't forget.